Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Luke Herrine, a PhD in law candidate and Law and Political Economy Fellow at Yale Law School. We will discuss his draft article, Socializing Contract. So welcome to the show, Luke.
Thanks, Brian. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited about this, and I'm so glad that our mutual friend, Ramsey Woodcock, introduced you to me, because I thought this paper was great, really provocative, really a deep piece, and really made me think a lot more about kind of how we conceptualize contract law in both descriptive and normative terms. So congrats, and I can't wait to see the final version come out in print.
Thanks, Brian. That's the goal of the article, even if I don't convince you of the perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, so for listeners who might not be familiar with the kinds of competing theories of contract and law more generally, and political philosophy more generally, that you discuss in the paper, and also with some of the terminology that you use, I wonder if you could start by just briefly saying what you mean by socializing contract, or rather, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like it might even be better to think about it in terms of resocializing contract.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. So the way I think about, one way to answer that question is conceptually, and another way is historically, and resocializing contract would suggest a more of a historical answer. The way I do it historically in the introduction, so maybe it's useful to provide a little bit of background. So, the contract law only really comes into its own in the late 19th century. And it comes into its own at the same time that a sort of abstract notion of contract as, a free agreement between two rational parties becomes the definition of what a contract is and the organizing principle of contract law. So, for instance, if you go back further in time, if you go back to Blackstone, contract is not a separate category in the law. It's different types of contracts are subcategories in different types of property exchange or, family law arrangement. But when contract gets pulled out in the late 19th century as a separate discipline, it comes to have this particular type of meaning, a sort of an idealized form of a free will of parties joining together. And that we might call that the sort of original formalist vision of what contract is. I would say that's a desocialized version of contract. Namely, it takes the idea of what's going on in a contract as the joining of the wills of two parties, regardless of their social standing, regardless of what they're doing to, what their joint project is, regardless of, where in the country they are, of what their gender is, of what their race is, et cetera, et cetera. And it's desocialized in that descriptive sense, but it's also desocialized in a normative sense, which is that there's no the question of whether the details of the sort of moral propriety of the details of their agreement is treated as up to them, and as it were, that their obligations to other people don't really pertain to the question of how to enforce their obligations to each other, and the way that their agreement fits in with other agreements don't pertain to what matters about that agreement. And then that has real bite in the Lochner era, when the idea of contract as a sort of holy domain into which courts should not inquire becomes constitutionalized, and becomes a way to strike down ways of restructuring how agreements are entered into, specifically in the labor relationship. So that's sort of the original desocialization of contract, you might say. And then the response to that, one of the responses to that is what's sort of broadly called the American legal realist movement, which had a number of responses to, from mockery to sort of deep philosophical deconstruction, to this original formalist account, pointing out that that power between the parties matters a lot, and that courts could, to ignore the social situation in which a contract exists is to miss a lot of what is really both socially and morally important about that agreement, and particularly with respect to labor contracts. So, the freedom of contract between a baker who's working 15 hours a day and the bakery that's employing him, the relative freedom of each of those parties is different, and a law that restricts hours of bakers might actually increase the freedom of choice of the baker, rather than diminishing it by, in this formal sense of preventing his ability to contract for, theoretically any number of hours. So that I would call that the American legal realist movement, the first sort of socialization of contract, both in that descriptive and normative sense. And that, general attitude about contract, to be very simplistic about this history, sort of prevailed until the 70s, when there were a lot of crises in the, sort of political and moral crises in the United States that where that opened up the possibility for a new desocialization of contract. And so Charles Freed, who's a sort of famous moral and legal philosopher, and also judge, wrote a book called Contract as Promise in the late 1970s, and Richard Posner and other economic analysts were writing work also in the 1970s, attacking this notion of thinking about contract in terms of, different types of contract in different social situations, and thinking about contracts as, different, some contracts are between collectivities, and there's a sort of continuum between tort and contract and between property and contract, and there's not a sort of self-sustaining category. And so anyway, Freed and Posner, both, right-wing, what they would call sort of classical liberals or libertarians, saw this as both morally and descriptively problematic, and they created what I would say is a second desocialization of contract, and what I'm trying to do is sort of resocialize contract in the sort of spirit of the original realist movement. And I should say I'm not the only person to make this sort of objection, since Freed and Posner wrote that. But I guess that's the basic idea of what sort of historically and conceptually the question of desocialization and resocialization of contract is.
Right. Well, so, I mean, as I take it, in your paper, you argue, and I found this convincing and compelling, that sort of the current conventional wisdom on contract theory and how to understand the structure and purpose of contract law kind of grew out of Freed and Posner's project, as well as the work of many other kind of scholars working in a similar vein, heavily influenced by kind of neoclassical economics and so on. I mean, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that theory of contract and what it sees as a justification for contract law, and why people think that theory has certain advantages.
So, right. So Freed and Posner are certainly to be distinguished, and they definitely don't think they agree with each other. I sort of, whether they would agree with my portrayal of both of them as desocializing contract, I think Freed might. Whether Posner would, is a different question. But so the Posnerian conception is the law and economic conception, that sort of neoclassical economics conception that you mentioned, which is that what legal scholarship ought to be is just, I mean, especially the sort of like high version of the sort of most pure version of the Posner point is that, the common law is efficient, and what we should do is understand why it's efficient. And efficient here means, maximizes the social welfare, or actually maximizes the wealth of everybody as much as possible, given scarce resources. And so, how does that pertain to contract? Well, the basic idea is that, if as neoclassical economists assume, people are the best judges of what's good for them, and are basically always going to make the right decision about what's good for them, then all of their decisions about anything, but also especially about which contracts they should enter into, are going to be the decisions about they're going to choose the right contracts for them. And so, and not only are they going to choose the right contracts for them, because that's everyone's doing that, and because so long as you live in a free market, and what exactly that means is somewhat hand wavy, but so long as you live in a free market, when everybody does that, things work out such that resources go to the people who most value them. And so basically the role of contract law is to let people arrange things in the best way for themselves, which aggregates to the best way for everyone. And the role of the law is just to let that happen, to facilitate contracts and to make it as least costly as possible. So that's the sort of attraction. That's the basic intuition behind that view. Which I should note, there's a certain socialized, from a normative perspective, there's a certain socialized aspect to that view, which is to say, it's not, as it were, normatively prior that you should respect the will of the parties. It's that the social welfare, the net social welfare, is maximized if you respect the will of the parties. So we can take into account how contracts fit into society. It's just that the best way to account for that is to let people do it themselves. If you make certain assumptions about how people make decisions. And then Charles Fried is going to be a very different perspective, although they often end with the same sorts of political conclusions. Fried is a neo-Kantian moralist who thinks that contract is, his views have shifted somewhat over the years, but that contract is basically promise, and promise is a moral institution that has a particular structure that one can sort of uncover if you observe how it works in different contexts. And the structure of the moral institution is such that it's two free and rational parties respecting the wills of each other. And so the thing, if you believe that society should be oriented towards equal freedom, that we all share freedom with each other equally, you should, contract is in some ways a primary institution of that. It allows people to do what they want, to do exactly as much as they want as doesn't harm other people, because they're getting somebody to agree about how far that they are able to go without harming them. So that's a sort of very, very basic version of the view. And that's a very different way of justifying it, right? That's not, it's better for the net social welfare in some instrumental sense, but rather there's something sort of inherent, like the thing we ought to care about is not welfare, whatever that means, but rather freedom, respect for each other's free choices. And contract also has that sort of structure. And so that's the basic appeal. And so for Fried, what was sort of distasteful about what he called the gauchissant mix of, I forget exactly what it is, but he's sort of very dismissive of like the allergy to the free markets that he saw in the 1970s legal academy, is that it doesn't respect people's choices. It doesn't allow people to be authors of their own lives, and that's the primary value of having a contract law that basically just enforces people's wills wherever contracts are made, and leaves the rest to other areas of law or to people's individual decisions.
So if I may, it seems like the kind of Posnerian view is proposing a kind of consequentialist justification for contract enforcement.
Right, exactly.
And the Fried view is, proposing a kind of deontological justification for contract enforcement. But at the end of the day, they're both justifications for contract enforcement. And you present in the paper a number of criticisms of both of these views, kind of both individually and collectively. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you see as the weaknesses of these perspectives, and do you see those weaknesses as primarily descriptive, normative, or both?
To answer the last question first, it's some mix of descriptive and normative. Although what I think, and the mix varies for the different ones. So with respect to formalist views, and this goes beyond Fried in particular, and I'm classifying as formalist here, some people who might not be comfortable with that classification. But what I say is a formalist view is a view that understands contract as having a logic that can be uncovered qua contract. That is to say, there is something about the fact that there's that two people are freely engaging in a joint project, that one can use that fact to come to certain conclusions about how one ought to design rules to deal with those sorts of agreements. And the problem that I have with those sorts of views is that they don't that they're desocialized. In other words, that they don't they sort of treat it as morally irrelevant how contracts fit together with other contracts, and how a given contract between two parties has impacts on other parties and the broader social world. And which is to say, it's not that they think those things are irrelevant, but just those things are not relevant to the question of how one understands the moral logic of contract, and the moral logic of contract is what one ought to understand if one's understanding, what sort of contract law is qua contract law. So I actually have a number of examples, not a number of sorts of objections, not all of which I go through in the article, but the two sorts of objection I talk through in the article are, one, I actually think it's the sort of easier to understand, I think, is that this question of power inequalities, that when people who are, have roughly the same amount of social standing and resources, and other things that we might think constitute power, form an agreement, that's a sort of situation where one thinks that, there's a sort of there's an exchange there. There's a mutual there's two parties are relatively independent, and there's the sorts of dependence that is created between the parties is sort of relatively easy to understand as the joining together of two wills. But the more unequal the parties are, the more that contracts, especially contracts for labor, for essential goods, for debts, some of which historically turn into labor agreements through things like indentured servitude, those sorts of contracts become more and more ways to, you can one way to describe them. I mean, you can still very clearly describe them as two parties freely agreeing to do something, and agreeing to do the thing that's best for them given their social situation. And yet there's still something morally problematic about the fact that, somebody's entering into an indentured servitude agreement, or certainly an agreement to be enslaved, although that might have different sorts of formal problems. So one way to describe that is that, contract is understood to be a sort of horizontal relationship, a relationship of I'm forgetting the exact word, whereas the relationship between two unequal people, whether it's via contract or via, a customary relationship, like between a peasant and a lord, is fundamentally a relationship of domination. So even the fact that people agree to something doesn't mean that there's not something problematic about that relationship. And so I go through some of the details about what formalists are inclined to say about this, which I don't think are very convincing. But that's one sort of problem with just sort of looking at what the moral logic of contract is. It doesn't allow you to think about those sorts of cases, certainly in a continuum, and even sort of in the extreme cases, you have to sort of take a contractual logic and then balance it against some other logic, and then that sort of pushes the question up a level. So that's one sort of problem. And then another sort of problem, I think, goes more to the core of the sorts of pictures that formalists want to paint about what contracts are doing, which is that it's actually not entirely clear that you can say what two people have agreed to, especially in a complex society, especially in a society where there are so many contracts, without taking into account both some of the descriptive and moral aspects of the context in which those parties enter the contract. And so to try to be less abstract about that, the most extreme case of this has been relatively familiar in the contract literature over recent years. So when somebody enters into a contract that they just haven't read, and there's no reasonable prospect to think that they have read it, what have they agreed to do? It's not, certainly the mutual will of the parties doesn't tell you all that much about what they've agreed to do. And indeed, there's a recent article by Margaret Jane Radin and Robin Carr, which I think is a great article, that argues that, actually, yes, if you're fully committed to something like a sort of a self-contained logic of contract, you have to agree that these no-read contracts are basically, the only thing agreed to is like the most essential terms that people would agree to. And my point is that if you accept that, the thing that you're saying is that, what people, I should clarify, for Carr and Radin, the thing people agree to is not what they subjectively agree to. It's not just like, you can't just not read the contract and say you haven't agreed to it, but rather it's some objective notion about what is reasonable to be expected to be able to understand about the agreement. In fact, they have a whole discussion about how meaning is created conversationally, using this notion of conversational implicature that comes out of the philosophy of language literature. And so, the point there is that, what you can understand about what the parties have agreed to depends on, the norms of the area of life in which they're embedded. And if that's the case, then the very core of the contract, the very content of the agreement, and whether an agreement has been entered into at all, depends on social context, depends on a normative analysis, a descriptive analysis of social context, of how language and agreement work in a given context, and a normative analysis about what is reasonable to expect of somebody in a given context, which is a sort of tort-like analysis almost. So anyway, so that's the nature of the sort of objection. I think you can make similar sorts of problems. There's a piece I cut out of the article about, well, how do contracts affect other contracts? And so I won't get into that here, but that's also true for formalists. And then maybe you want to pause and ask a further question, but I can also get into what I think is the problem with the economic view as well.
Well, so maybe you could do that in the context of some of the kind of criticisms you offer, both historically and kind of your own take on those criticisms. Like maybe starting with, well, for example, like, I observe that, at least on my reading of the article, you seem to offer both observations on realist and critical realist takes on what it would look like to socialize contracts. And in particular, in the realist context, you spend a great deal of time talking about Carl Llewellyn as well as other legal realist thinkers from that period. I was wondering if maybe you could contrast the way that someone like Llewellyn thought about understanding contract law in a socialized sense, maybe like through his work on the UCC or something else, in relation to how the kind of law and economics movement has conceptualized thinking about how contracts work in a social sense.
Yeah, so I think Carl Llewellyn doesn't have so his view, I think, somewhat shifts over the years, especially as he gets later into a career. I think he becomes somewhat more conservative, although I think there's a consistent thread throughout. But so interestingly, economic analysts are going to want to claim Carl Llewellyn, or they're going to say what Carl Llewellyn is doing is great, and they're often identify themselves as realist. What Carl Llewellyn is doing is great, but he's just like, his economics isn't good enough. Like, he was writing at a time when economics wasn't developed enough, and now we have better economics. And so, like, there's basically, it's like as if physics has advanced and we now understand more about the subatomic world, and we can, have a better analysis. But like, thank you, Newton, right? But you did a lot of good things, but now we know more about the world. That's the sort of way that, Alan Schwartz has an article about Carl Llewellyn that talks about him in this way. But the way Llewellyn understood, so I think that actually just fundamentally misconceives what he's doing in a certain way, which is that because in fact, Carl Llewellyn said that he was sort of against neoclassical economics and pro-institutionalist economics, as he himself wrote. But anyway, he would understand. So he understood what was happening in common law. Like I would say his mature view, his earlier view is like he's often just sort of throwing rocks at the edifice and just saying, well, the way law works is like it changes through time, and you have to be open to changes. And you formalists don't get anything, and actually even social theorists don't get anything. But anyway, his developed view basically understands what's happening in common law as judges doing something using what he calls situation sense, which is to sort of there's a dispute that comes to them, and they have to make sense of what's happening in the dispute. So they have to do interpretive work to get to say like, well, not just what's happening between the two parties, which is something formalists would say, that this dispute comes to the court, and the role of the judge is sort of like analyze the moral logic of the relationship between the parties as a neutral observer, and develop rules that would make sense to any two parties that are in this sort of relationship, independent of their individuality. And what Llewellyn would understand as going on is it's that in a sense, but it's also that the structure of the relationship between the two parties it depends on how it fits into a broader social field. So the way that parties on a securities exchange enter into a contract, and the sorts of contracts they're going to want to enter into is different from the way people who are buying goods on Amazon are going to enter into a contract, or the people who are starting to use the Facebook platform are entering into a contract, which is different from the way that an uncle who tells his nephew that he'll pay him a certain amount of money if he doesn't smoke or drink for by the time he's 21 enters into a contract, and that so part of what a court understands when the court understands the sort of nature of the agreement that's being entered into is the nature of the social situation in which the agreement is being entered into, which doesn't mean that every social situation has a different rule of contract necessarily, but rather that what is going to be relevant is going to depend, what is going to be relevant to understanding what's going on between two parties is not going to just depend on what they themselves agreed to, which is always going to have some sort of ambiguity, as in the way that I talked about when I was talking about Radin and Carr. But also, the courts are going to want to take with different degrees of seriousness if there's a power inequality, or if there's a sort of broader question about whether these sorts of contracts should be entered into, or whether they ought to be entered into only under certain conditions in the social context at issue. So, for instance, you might not want people entering into, if there's organized exchanges for securities or for commodities, you might not want to enforce an over-the-counter agreement, or you might want to sort of read it very, strictly against the drafter or something like that. In addition to that, he's going to say that there's a certain notion of wisdom that's sort of an Aristotelian notion of wisdom that Llewellyn's going to care about, which is that it's part of the social situation isn't just that the parties themselves entering into a contract are embedded within an ongoing social interaction, but that the court has to understand what its role is and how its role might evolve. So whereas a court, when people are social, when in sort of small, in an early America, when markets are relatively distant from each other and there's no big corporations, and the primary labor agreements are not, there are sort of between one, 5 workers and one boss, and maybe between people who are traveling, et cetera, et cetera. The way that and the power of a court, the court, there's not sort of a central army, et cetera, et cetera. Like the sorts of interpretive resources that a court is going to have at its disposal is going to be different than in a society when everyone more or less respects the law and nobody can flee the law, and there aren't sort of alternative courts, and et cetera. And also, anyway, so, but this is just sort of give a broad sense of, for Llewellyn, it's going to be, to take into account all these factors, it's hard to come up with sort of an overarching theory. There's going to be a broad sense of situation sense, which is to say a court is going to sort of have to think about the details of what matters in any given agreement, and it's going to have some amount of judgment about what matters that can't sort of be fully conceptualized in a high theory.
Mm-hmm. Well, so in the paper, you also discuss some what you refer to as kind of critical realists. Other people might kind of lump them in with critical legal studies more generally, takes on contract theory. I mean, I wonder if you might kind of just really briefly talk a little bit about that critique and how it relates to your concept or the concept of socialization of contract law that you talk about in the paper.
Right. So I think what's important about the realist tradition, and as it develops into the critical realist tradition, is that it takes what I sort of talked about in terms of Llewellyn's insight, although he's not the only person who's writing about this sort of stuff, and takes it a step further by understanding that the fact that the fact that there is a contract in the first place, and that there's a court with certain types of competencies and powers to regulate or to resolve a dispute between two parties in the first place depends on a whole set of prior political decisions about how a given area of social life is regulated, about who has which resources in that given area of social life, and about what the role of the state is with respect to that area of social life, and how courts fit in with that state. All of which is some to say that is in some sense trivial, but the important point there is that all of those agreements are contingent, right? So to be much more concrete about it, if a court is presented, and to be concrete in a way that I think is maybe somewhat politically salient today, the fact that a court is presented with, say there's a health insurance company that's enforcing, a contract against a policyholder who can't pay, or who doesn't want to pay because they think that they shouldn't have to pay or something like that. The fact that that's even a contract question in the first place is only because healthcare is a commodity, and health insurance is subject to contract in the United States, right? Which it is not, or which it is in a much more limited way in many other countries. And even the details of that contract and the sort of one-sidedness of that contract depend on how broad state health insurance is, and what regulations are about what insurance companies can do and the like. And that's, again, like relatively trivial and obvious, but if that's all true, then if you treat that stuff as irrelevant to a court approaching an agreement between an insurance company and a policyholder, then you're missing something important about the social forces that make contracting necessary and maybe desirable in a given area of law, and also the role that courts play in reproducing that given way of ordering social life. And so, with respect to insurance contracts, it's somewhat maybe ridiculous to say, but if all courts just refuse to enforce insurance contracts, that would create a lot of things, both good and bad, right? Some people would, suddenly not have to pay their bills, but maybe insurance companies totally collapse, then nobody would be insured. But what would the knock-on effect of that be? Well, would the political reality be such that, judges would be kicked off the bench, or would it be that, suddenly we'd have to reckon with the question about who should get health insurance and why? Just examining that question, I think opens up space for asking for saying that, actually judges in some sense are silently engaging in those judgments anyways, even if they're not explicitly doing so, right? A judge is not saying, oh man, if I don't, I could tear this whole health insurance system down if I don't enforce that contract. But I'm not going to do that because it's too uncertain, right? Most judges aren't actually engaging in that judgment. But those are a set of judgments that are relevant to the question, morally relevant to the question about whether and on what terms to enforce a contract. And a judge's question about their own role in the social system. And so to bring it back to the question of how that fits in with my critiques, I think that's the sort of thing that you just can't cognize if you think about contracts as purely in terms of an internal logic, and you can't cognize, and we didn't talk about this that much, in terms of if you think about contracts purely in terms of two parties maximizing their welfare given scarce resources, because in order to conceptualize the sorts of thing that I was talking about, you have to be able to think about how other parts of the social system, other areas of law, structure the space in which contract operates, and to see those settlements as not fixed and not sort of inherent, but always subject to either some sort of minor adjustment, which could then have knock-on effects, or major adjustment, depending on if the Supreme Court were to sort of like strike down health insurance contracts as unconstitutional, or strike down collective bargaining agreements as unconstitutional, for instance. Anyway, so I think that's the sort of real power that thinking about contract as socialized, both descriptively and morally, can provide to contract theory.
Well, so if I may, I mean, at least my reading of your paper was you had certain sympathies to this kind of critical realist approach, but also maybe certain reservations. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of your own concept of what it would mean to socialize contract and how we ought to think about that project from a theoretical and policy-based perspective.
Right. So what I just described was more along the lines. It was a little bit closer to my view than I think what the critical legal studies view would be. So for the critical legal, for somebody like Duncan Kennedy, it's almost as if like even every private law dispute that's in front of a judge is a potential moment for revolution. Duncan Kennedy is I don't know if he would describe himself as revolutionary or not, but he certainly believes that our society, is an anti-capitalist and believes that we need a fundamentally different society. But there's almost some sense that Williams versus Walker Thomas furniture. When the judge when Judge Skelly Wright takes the step into the void of unconscionability and opens up the space to think altruistically about Black people in segregated Washington, D.C. being forced to enter into, deeply predatory, what are basically rent-to-own agreements in modern terminology. When you don't enforce that, you sort of like take one step closer to the potential of restructuring the whole legal system. And I guess I would have there's a sense in which I think that's right, but there's also a sense in which I think it's worth thinking about how contract rules, first of all, vary with social situation, and insofar as they vary, have understanding the internal logic of those rules, even if you understand that logic as indeterminate and changing, has an advantage, because it allows one to think about, because we don't because how we conceptualize ourselves is partially structured by how we by these contracts, by the forms of relationships in which we enter. So it's not to say that that current structure of landlord-tenant agreements are good, but to think about what a judge is doing and enforcing a landlord-tenant agreement as just being captured by ideology and failing to sort of like deeply empathize with the tenant, I think misses the fact of the sort of the sets of settlements that make a landlord-tenant agreement happen, and the sort of political responsibility that one would have to engage in to think about different ways to disrupt a landlord, the system that makes landlord-tenant agreements possible if you think they're unequal, which requires thinking about how landlord-tenant agreements are situated within other social agreements, rather than just thinking about it as some sort of like veil of ideology that we can just get past, if that is coherent enough.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I mean, Luke, I think in closing, although I may have a follow up as well. I mean, it strikes me that you offer a really kind of compelling critique of how neoclassical economics, through the lens of sort of the law and economics vision of contract theory, has kind of desocialized and offered both a kind of descriptively and normatively unsatisfying account of how contract law works in practice, in theory and in practice, at least in part because of its sort of unacknowledged ideological priors that kind of it comes to the table with, that prevent it from seeing the kind of broader social context in which contract theory works. So I guess my question is, when it comes to this project of socializing or resocializing context, and sort of looking beyond economics to other fields of social science, to the kind of social context in which people engage in these kind of inherently political and and social relationships, power-based relationships, is the project one of sort of removing or kind of adopting or getting rid of that kind of ideological lens, or simply being cognizant of the ideological lens? Because I guess I struggle to see how we get away from ideology in this context.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so I guess it depends on what one means by ideology. It's used in sort of very different ways in different literatures, but my inclination is to say, with respect to neoclassical economics, that there are sort of better and worse ways of doing it, and I think I sort of talk about some of these varieties in the article. And it's one thing to just sort of, and very few people do this anymore, to do what Posner did early on, and what people like Milton Friedman did for a long time, which is just to just treat the world as if it is this to say that the only rigorous economic analysis is to analyze this utopic world where everybody is fully rational, where markets are quote unquote perfectly competitive because all firms are quote unquote price takers, that are on the knife's edge of failing if they don't fully maximize the preferences of every consumer, where money is sort of just like there's no monetary policy. Money just sort of like is the sort of way we communicate our preferences in some like diaphanous way, et cetera, et cetera. And we just say, well, like we just assume the world is that way, and that is what it means to think rigorously. That's what it means to think economically, right? That's I think what Slavoj Žižek would call pure ideology. But it's another sort of thing to say, for some sorts of questions, if we want to understand, for instance, what the effect of on the price of oil is going to be of this, closing down these gas stations on the West Coast, right? And we have to estimate what that is, and given for that sort of narrow predictive question, we can make a whole number of simplifying assumptions. That's a sort of much more practical use of potentially even neoclassical economic models to estimate some sort of price elasticity or something, which don't necessarily have normative implications. And there's a whole bunch of things in between. And to me, the much more interesting set of things to understand is that if one's going to take a more humble version of neoclassical economic analysis, one needs to situate it within a broader understanding of what we're doing when we enforce contracts, because it can't just be we're allowing people to engage in welfare maximizing behavior, because that's not how the world works. So we can analyze the world we can analyze people as if that's what they're doing for certain purposes, but we can't just assume that's how the whole thing works and that everything works out. So that requires taking, we might say ideology seriously, but here the sort of ideology that we're talking about is, what is, asking a question about what the purpose of organizing something through contract is, about what, given that broader frame, and whether or not we accept a broader frame, what the purpose of, what the value of enforcing a given contract is, what the value of giving parties the ability to structure their own agreements, and within which bounds, and subject to which sorts of remedies. Those are the sorts of core questions of contract theory, but being able to answer them as political questions, I guess, which is to say, ideological or not, the way we answer those questions in some sense depends on why we think contracts are good. And I think it's just a much more complicated question, because why contracts are good is different in different contexts. Both freedom and welfare enhancing properties are matter, and also there might be other sorts of purposes that we might care about. And to be able to take that sort of thing into account, you actually have to have a broader theory about, why do we have healthcare? Why do we have why do we have consumer markets for books? Why do we have commodities markets, et cetera? And how do those fit in with other markets? And to be able to answer those sorts of questions, one has to be able to draw from a whole bunch of different social forms of social research, not just neoclassical economics, and not even primarily, and also to have a broader sort of political, I don't want to say a sort of overarching political theory, but a political sensitivity to what matters and why.
Well, Luke, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed reading the paper. I really enjoyed talking to you about it. And I hope listeners will check out the entire piece, because, even though it's a long conversation, there was a lot more in the paper that we didn't have a chance to get to.
Thanks so much, Brian. Thanks for taking the time, and sorry for joining on.
Whereas the aforementioned party of the first part hereby contracts with the party of the second part, who shall be known.
Hello, this is Burt Reynolds. Contracts can be very confusing. The Federal Trade Commission has a few words of advice for you. First, do not sign a contract until you've read and understood it. Sometimes the small print takes away what the big print gives. Second, if you have any questions, consult your lawyer or the neighborhood legal service office. It would save you a lot of money in the long run. For more advice on evaluating a contract, write Truth in Lending, Federal Trade Commission, Washington, D.C. That's Truth in Lending, Federal Trade Commission, Washington, D.C.